Tonight, the fire has gone out. Not completely. Somewhere beneath the grey ash inside the iron stove, one coal may still be alive, but the room around it has surrendered to the cold. Frost has thickened along the inside of the window. A tin cup left on the table carries a skin of ice. Shirts, stockings and trousers hang from pegs near the wall, stiff enough to hold their own shape. Beneath layers of quilts, the family remains very still, not because anyone is sleeping comfortably, but because getting dressed has become the first unpleasant duty of the day. Before we settle into this long winter, take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which part of pioneer life you would find hardest to endure. Now the room waits for someone to leave the bed. That person will cross a floor cold enough to punish bare feet, kneel before the stove, open the iron door, and search the ash for a spark. If one coal glows red when the draft reaches it, the morning can begin. If it does not, the fire must be rebuilt from kindling, shavings, scraps, twisted grass, corncobs, or whatever fuel the household managed to save. And sometimes, the first thing placed into the stove is not a picturesque split log. It is a dried cow chip. That small indignity tells us almost everything about winter on the Great Plains. A family might possess land, a cabin, a stove, a few animals, and enough determination to cross half a continent. None of those things guaranteed a convenient pile of firewood. Where trees were scarce, fuel could mean roots, stalks, hay twisted into tight bundles, corncobs, dried manure, or coal bought with money already needed for flour, nails, lamp oil, seed, and taxes. The stove did not care about dignity. It cared about dry material and moving air. A surviving Nebraska cabin gives this room a measurable shape. George W. Palmer built it in 1867 from mixed hardwoods near Beatrice. The original space measured 14 feet by 16 feet, 224 square feet in which heat, bedding, food, tools, work, and family life had to negotiate for room. Later, a lean-to enlarged it. At first, however, that single room was the house. It was small enough for one stove to influence. Once the first flame caught, the room divided itself into invisible territories. The few feet nearest the stove warmed first. The far wall remained cold. The space by the door belonged to drafts. Warmer air collected near the ceiling, while the floor kept its grudges. A person beside the stove could feel one side warming as the other remained chilled. This was the household's entire climate system. The stove had to heat the air, cook breakfast, warm water, dry clothing, protect the youngest children, and preserve enough fuel for the night ahead. It served as furnace, cooktop, oven, water heater, clothes dryer, and general centre of civilization. It was the only appliance in the house, which was convenient because it was also trying to become every appliance not yet invented. Yet the stove solved nothing by itself. Hands had to gather the fuel, carry it indoors, keep it dry, break it into useful pieces, clear the ash, watch the draft, protect the stovepipe, and decide how fiercely the fire could burn. A bright fire felt generous. It was also expensive. Every armful fed into the stove in the morning was an armful no longer available at midnight. Every extra pot heated on the iron top consumed part of the winter reserve. A household that burned too freely during the first sharp weeks could discover, in the hardest part of the season, that comfort had quietly eaten survival. So the day began with calculation. How much fuel remained near the wall? How much stood outside beneath snow or canvas? Was it dry? Could anyone reach it if a storm arrived? Would the fire be needed for bread? Was water already liquid, or would ice have to be melted? Were the children's clothes merely cold or damp from the day before? Did an animal need attention outside? Was anyone coughing? Consider the wet mitten hanging beside the stove. It needed heat to dry. Place it too far away, and it remained damp. Place it too close, and it could scorch. The same fire warming that mitten also heated breakfast. The person eating it would soon carry more fuel, feed livestock, clear snow, or repair something winter had damaged. Nothing stood alone. Beds, trunks, a table, stools, food stores, tools, clothing, dishes, and human bodies all competed for the same limited floor. Privacy became less a physical condition than a courtesy everyone agreed to perform. A one-room cabin offered excellent family togetherness, largely because there was nowhere else to go. The table could hold breakfast, sewing, schoolwork, tool repair, bread dough, or a basin of water. A wall peg might support a coat, harness, sack, or utensil depending on the hour. The room changed function because it could not change size. Through all of it, the door mattered. Every opening released warmth. Each trip outside had to be worth the heat lost and the cold admitted. The person returning might bring fuel, water, eggs, milk, or news from a barn becoming its own crisis. Winter rarely attacked with one grand disaster. More often, it arrived as a chain of small demands. A boot split, a hinge loosened, flour ran low, the child's cough deepened, snow covered the path to the fuel pile, a chimney drew poorly, a draft found a new crack, one hen stopped laying, one bucket froze, one night's fuel burned faster than expected. Any single problem could be managed. The danger appeared when several met inside the same 14 by 16-foot room. That is where the familiar image of the heroic pioneer becomes less useful. Endurance mattered. So did strength, patience, skill, luck, money, neighbours, weather, and decisions made months before the first frost. The family waking beside that cold stove was living inside the results of summer. The fuel had been gathered when the grass was high. Food had been planted, harvested, dried, salted, stored or purchased before roads became difficult. The roof had been repaired before snow pressed down upon it. Clothing had been sewn, patched, traded for, or passed from one person to another. The chimney had either been made ready, or it had not. By the time the first pot began to warm and the frost on the window softened into water, the room would seem almost merciful. The children could leave the quilts. Clothing would bend again. Breakfast might release the smell of cornmeal, breakfast, bacon, or something much plainer. The iron stove would tick as it heated. For a few minutes, the household might appear to have won. But outside the walls, the fuel pile was smaller than yesterday, and the winter had only just begun. The work that decided whether the fire would still be burning in February had begun months earlier, under a sun bright enough to make winter feel theoretical. In summer, the prairie looked generous. Grass rose high, crops pushed upward through soil. The days were long enough to make one believe there would always be time. There was not. A homesteading family could look across its land in July and see almost everything it would need in January, but only in unfinished form. Corn might become meal, livestock feed or fuel. Hay might become fodder, mattress stuffing, roof repair, or twisted bundles for the stove. Beans could become months of suppers. A hog might become meat, fat, soap, and a difficult family discussion conducted much later than anyone preferred. Summer abundance was not stored survival. It was an opportunity to work. Fuel came first because the stove could not burn in tension. Where timber was available, wood had to be cut, split, hauled, stacked, and protected from rain. Greenwood burned poorly, smoked heavily, and wasted heat driving out its own moisture. Proper fuel needed time to dry. Cutting wood after the first snow was less a plan than an admission. On treeless stretches of the plains, the calculation became stranger. Corncobs were saved, stalks were gathered, roots were dug out, hay was twisted into dense ropes that burned more slowly than loose handfuls. Dried cattle manure was collected and stacked under cover. This was one of those tasks rarely shown in heroic paintings of westward settlement. No artist seemed eager to paint a solemn adult filling a wagon with dried dung. Yet the work mattered. A household could survive wounded pride more easily than an empty fuel box, Children often helped. They gathered chips, cobs, brush and scraps, then brought them home to be sorted and dried. What looked like litter in August became a measurable quantity of heat in January. The family also studied the house. A cabin was never simply finished. It was only between repairs. Rain exposed roof leaks. Wind found cracks. Mice discovered openings that builders had missed. Doors sagged. Mud plaster dried and split. Sod walls settled. Chimneys loosened. Warm weather offered a chance to correct these failures while fingers still worked easily and daylight remained. Cracks in a log wall could be packed with mud, clay, grass, or other available material. A door might receive another latch. A roof could be patched with sod, shingles, poles, tar paper, or whatever the household could obtain and trust not to fall inward during a storm. The goal was not modern comfort. It was to slow the escape of heat. A cabin needed to remain warmer than the air outside, dry enough to protect bedding, and stable enough that the people inside could continue working. A leak in summer was an annoyance. A small leak above a bed in winter could soak a quilt, chill a sleeper, and create a new demand on the stove. More stove heat required more fuel. More fuel meant more trips outdoors. More trips meant more warmth lost through the door. One loose patch of roof could recruit the entire household into its consequences. Food required the same long view. Gardens and fields had to provide not just harvest meals, but food that could survive storage. Potatoes, onions, turnips, beans, corn, and squash demanded different handling. Some needed drying, some needed cool storage. Nearly everything needed protection from rodents, moisture, mold, and the hungry optimism of the people storing it. Meat brought another chain of labor. An animal had to be raised, fed, slaughtered, cut, salted, smoked, dried, rendered, or eaten quickly. Fat could become cooking material, lamp fuel, or soap. Bones could flavor broth. Nothing was casually discarded if it could perform one more duty. Clothing carried summer work into winter. Shirts were patched, stockings were darned, mittens were made, coats were altered for children who had inconveniently continued growing. Blankets and quilts were repaired before they were needed every night. Then there were the animals. A family might depend on horses or oxen for movement, a cow for milk, chickens for eggs, and hogs for meat. Livestock needed shelter, feed, water, and access through snow. Hay had to be cut and stacked. Fences had to be checked. A weak enclosure that held during August might fail under wind, ice, or a frightened animal in December. The settlers were preparing two households for winter, the one inside the cabin and the one in the barn. If livestock died, the family lost food, work power, money, and breeding stock. If someone was injured while caring for them, the cabin lost labor. One broken gate could become a financial disaster with legs. Autumn tightened the schedule. Days shortened. Mornings cooled. Crops had to be gathered before frost. Fuel stacks had to be covered without trapping moisture. Food had to be counted honestly. There was a difference between a full-looking pantry and enough food for 5 people over many months. This was the season of uncomfortable arithmetic. The answers were not always reassuring. A family could enter winter already knowing supplies were thin. One failed crop, medical expense, dead animal, or debt payment could hollow out the stores before snow arrived. Optimism remained useful, but it did not add beans to a barrel. For a homesteader, preparation carried legal weight as well. The Homestead Act of 1862 allowed a qualified claimant to seek 160 acres, but the claim had to be occupied and improved. 5 years of residence, a house, cultivated land, witnesses, and final fees stood between filing and ownership. The total official fees could amount to $18, a small figure only until every other expense of settlement gathered around it. George Palmer built his Nebraska cabin in 1867. He received the patent to his claim in May 1875. The roof that held, the field that showed cultivation, and the family that remained through winter were not merely signs of endurance. They were part of turning work into legal possession. Neighbours mattered too. Families exchanged labour, borrowed tools, traded food, helped raise buildings, and warned one another about shortages. The popular image of the solitary pioneer improved by leaving those neighbours outside the frame. Self-reliance frequently required assistance. By the first hard frost, the household had done what it could. Fuel stood stacked, food occupied bins, sacks, crocks, barrels or hanging bundles. Bedding had been aired, chimneys had been inspected, animals stood behind patched walls, tools waited near the door. Then the weather changed. The last warm afternoon passed, a north wind moved across the grass. Water left outside formed a thin shell overnight. Breath became visible during morning chores. The family lit the stove not for cooking alone, but to warm the room. At that moment, every neglected repair, every damp bundle of fuel, every missed harvest day, and every saved scrap began to reveal its value. Winter did not begin with the first snow. It began with the first decision made too late. Too late was often measured in inches. A gap beneath a door, a crack between logs, a patch of roof where rain had softened the earth, a stovepipe joint that shifted when wind pressed against the wall. None looked dramatic in September. In January, each became an opening through which warmth escaped and winter entered. The first advantage of a one-room home was simple. There was less air to heat. George Palmer's 14 by 16-foot cabin might feel painfully crowded, but its limited volume gave the stove a fighting chance. Heat did not have to travel through hallways or vanish into unused rooms. One iron box could influence nearly the entire household. The disadvantage was just as clear. The household had to fit inside it. Pioneer homes on the plains were not all alike. Some families built log cabins where timber could be found. Others cut prairie sod and stacked it into thick walls. Some began in dugouts carved into a bank or slope, using the earth itself as shelter. A family might live in one form while gathering material for another. Each structure answered the same question. What can be built here, with what we have, before the weather changes? A log cabin made sense near reliable timber. Straight logs created solid walls, but the spaces between them demanded attention. Those gaps were filled with clay, mud, grass, stones or wood strips, depending on place and method. The filling dried, shrank, cracked and sometimes fell away. A wall that looked solid from across the room could still admit a thread of cold air sharp enough to find a sleeping child's neck. The people inside learned where the wind entered. Cloth might be pushed into a crack. Mud could be pressed over a failing patch. Newspapers, where available, could cover walls and reduce drafts, while offering headlines several months old. The news might be stale. The wind was not. Sod houses solved the timber problem with material beneath the grass. Settlers cut thick strips of prairie turf where roots held the soil tightly together and stacked them like enormous, untidy bricks. The walls could be remarkably thick. Earth resisted sudden temperature changes, so a well-built sod house could remain cooler in summer and hold warmth better in winter than its rough appearance suggested. From outside, it could resemble a piece of prairie that had developed a door. Inside, the advantages came with qualifications. Sod contained soil, roots, moisture, insects, and creatures that had not been consulted about the transfer of ownership. Walls could shed dirt, roofs might leak, heavy rain softened weak construction, grass could grow overhead, mice and other visitors were not unknown. A sod house could be warm. It was rarely mistaken for a hotel. When Uriah Oblinger reached Fillmore County, Nebraska, in the fall of 1872, he filed a claim west of Geneva and began the work of sod busting and building a sod house. His letters home did not describe an abstract frontier. They described a claim becoming physical through cut earth, labour, weather, crops, livestock and money. The roof was often the most dangerous compromise. Walls could be thick, while the space overhead depended on poles, brush, grass, sod, shingles, boards, or whatever combination the builder could afford. A roof needed enough slope to shed water and enough strength to carry its own weight. Snow made that calculation more serious. A leak above the stove might hiss and vanish. A leak above bedding could spoil the household's most important insulation. Furniture placement was therefore not decorative. Beds stayed away from obvious drafts when possible. The stove stood where heat could spread without setting walls. Clothing or furniture alight. Food stores needed to stay dry without becoming warm enough to spoil. Wet clothing gathered near the stove, but not close enough to scorch. There were few empty corners, because empty corners had not justified their existence. Windows admitted light and lost heat. Glass was valuable and difficult to replace. Some early shelters used greased paper, cloth, shutters, or very small panes. Frost inside the glass was not only picturesque, it showed that warm, moist indoor air had met a surface cold enough to freeze it. That moisture came from breathing, cooking, boiling water, wet boots and damp clothing. A tightly sealed room preserved heat, but trapped smoke, smells and dampness. A poorly sealed room breathed freely and froze everyone with admirable efficiency. The family needed a compromise. The stovepipe helped create it. Warm gases and smoke rose from the stove, travelled through the pipe, and escaped through the chimney. If the chimney drew properly, fresh air entered through cracks around doors, windows, floors, and walls to replace what left. Those hated drafts were part of the fire's breathing system. Seal the room too tightly, and the stove might draw poorly. Leave it too loose, and heat poured outside. Managing a cabin meant accepting that some cold air had to enter so smoke could leave. Floors made another difference. A wooden floor lifted the household above damp soil and offered a cleaner surface. But lumber cost money and labour. Many early cabins and dugouts began with packed earth. The floor nearest the stove dried first. The floor near the door collected snow, water, straw, and evidence of every outdoor task. There was no entrance hall in which winter could remove its boots. Without a finished ceiling, heat gathered among the rafters while feet remained cold below. Families hung clothing, herbs, food, tools, and household objects overhead, using space the floor could not spare. The cabin stored things vertically because it had exhausted the horizontal. Then there was the door. It needed to fit well enough to slow wind, but loosely enough to open after swelling, freezing, or settling. It needed hinges that held, a latch that worked, and enough strength to remain closed when weather pressed against it. Opening it in deep winter could change the room within seconds. Cold air spread across the floor. Children felt it first. Anyone sleeping low felt it longest. Fuel needed to come in. Water had to be fetched. Animals required care. Waste had to go out. No family could preserve heat by sealing itself inside until April. So people carried several things at once and planned the next task before lifting the latch. A forgotten bucket was not a small inconvenience. It was another opening of the door. By full winter, the household knew the behaviour of every part of its shelter. It knew which wall clicked during hard cold, where frost appeared first, which roof patch darkens during thaw, and which corner remains damp. The home spoke through drafts, drips, smoke, and shifting wood. A new line of frost, a dark patch above the bed, or smoke hesitating at the stove door told them where the structure was failing. The cabin could never remove winter. It could only slow it down. In the centre of that fragile boundary stood the stove, consuming the fuel that gave the walls meaning. The walls slowed winter, but the stove decided how much time the family had bought. In many one-room homes, it was a compact cast-iron machine standing on short legs, with a firebox, an iron door, and a stovepipe rising toward the roof or turning toward a chimney. Some households had cooking stoves with flat tops, removable iron lids, and small ovens. Others relied on simpler box stoves built mainly for heat, then balanced kettles and pans wherever the iron grew hot enough. Whatever its shape, the stove demanded an education. A new owner could not simply fill it, strike a match, and expect civilization to emerge. Fire required dry fuel, moving air, and enough heat to keep the fuel burning. The stove controlled these through openings, doors, and dampers. Open the draft, and air entered near or beneath the fire. Flames brightened, fuel burned faster. Close it too far, and the fire weakened, smoked, or died. The household learned these controls by experience, which was a polite way of saying that several breakfasts were delayed and at least one room filled with smoke. The morning fire often began with yesterday's remains. Before bed, the last adult awake might arrange the final fuel so that it burned slowly. Larger pieces could be placed over a bed of coals. Airflow was reduced. Ash gathered around the embers and helped insulate them. This was banking the fire. The aim was not to heat the cabin generously until dawn. That would consume too much fuel. The aim was to preserve life inside the stove. In the morning, ash was stirred carefully and the draft opened. A few red coals could ignite dry shavings or twisted grass. Small sticks followed, then larger fuel. The order mattered. A large log placed on a weak spark did not become a fire. It became a heavy object resting on optimism. Once the flame caught, the stovepipe warmed. Rising hot gases created the draft that pulled fresh air toward the fire. A well-drawing pipe carried smoke out of the room. A poor one returned smoke through the stove door, around loose joints, or directly into the faces of the people trying to correct it. Wind complicated matters. A chimney placed badly against a roofline could draw inconsistently. Sudden gusts might push smoke backward. Soot gathered inside the pipe. Damp wood or a slow, smoky fire encouraged deposits that reduced airflow and increased the danger of a chimney fire. The same pipe that carried danger away could become a danger of its own. It passed close to walls, ceilings, rafters, shingles, sod, cloth, and stored belongings. Heat radiated from its surface. A loose joint could leak smoke or sparks. A poorly protected opening through the roof could char nearby material. The family watched for signs of trouble. A strange smell, a weak draft, smoke where none belonged, metal hotter than expected, or the sharp roar of fire climbing into the pipe. The stove offered no automatic alarm. Its warning system was whichever person happened to be awake. Ash created another daily task. Too much ash could block airflow. Too little around a banked fire could allow coals to cool too quickly. The stove needed cleaning, but hot ash could conceal embers for hours. Carried outside carelessly, it might ignite dry grass. A wooden container, bedding, or rubbish. Sensible handling mattered because burning down the house while removing what had already burned was considered poor winter management. Fuel size changed the character of the fire. Thin pieces caught quickly and produced fast heat. Larger pieces lasted longer but required an established bed of coals. Corncobs burned differently from split wood. Hay bundles flared or smouldered according to how tightly they had been twisted. Dried animal fuel could produce strong coals with little flame when it was truly dry. Nebraska's scarcity of wood produced an especially ingenious machine. Accounts later gathered about early pioneer cooking described a hay-burning stove that resembled an ordinary iron cook stove, except for two long iron cylinders fixed at the rear. Each cylinder was packed with hay, and a spring pushed the fuel toward the firebox as it burned. Families kept additional cylinders filled and ready. It was a solution born from scarcity, and it required a household willing to turn loose grass into standardized stove fuel. As corn production expanded, corncobs offered another supply. In eastern Nebraska, where creek bottoms provided some timber, common iron cook stoves were widespread by the 1870s. Even there, much of the available wood could be green cottonwood, reluctant to burn until it had been dried. The fuel pile was therefore a schedule. The driest kindling was reserved for starting. Fast-burning material brought the stove up to temperature. Denser pieces supported longer tasks. Night demanded endurance rather than spectacle. Then came cooking. On a flat-top stove, heat was not distributed evenly. The iron directly above the firebox was hottest. Areas farther away were cooler. Pots moved across the surface according to what they needed. Water could be brought to a boil near the hottest point. then shifted aside. A stew could simmer in a cooler position. Bread depended on the oven reaching and holding useful heat, often judged without a numbered dial. The cook learned through the behavior of that particular stove, how rapidly water moved, where a pan browned too quickly, how the oven changed after another handful of fuel, and what a hard wind did to the draft. It was practical knowledge built from repetition. It was also knowledge with consequences. A weak fire produced heavy bread-delayed meals, and lukewarm water, an aggressive one, scorched food, consumed fuel, overheated the room, and made every iron surface more dangerous. Children learned the geography of heat early. The stove door, lids, pipe, and nearby tools could burn skin instantly. Skirts, sleeves, drying cloth, straw bedding, and wooden furniture had to remain clear. The room might be freezing near the wall, while the stove was hot enough to ignite fabric. Everyone wanted the warmth. Nobody could be careless near its source. Wet boots needed drying, but leather could harden or crack if placed too close. Mittens could steam, scorch, or fall. A baby required protection from cold, and from the iron object providing relief from it. At night, the fire was reduced again. Supper ended. Pots were cleaned or set aside. Water might be warmed for morning. Clothing was arranged to dry. Kindling was placed where it could be reached in darkness. Before lying down, the last adult awake lifted the latch once, checked the pipe, and chose the final pieces of fuel. Too small, and they vanished before midnight. Too large, and they might fail to catch properly. Too much air, and the stove consumed them quickly. Too little, and the fire smoked or died. The draft was closed. The iron ticked as temperatures changed. Wind moved around the cabin. The room slowly cooled. Beneath the fading flames, a bed of coals began to form. But the stove could produce heat only by consuming something the prairie did not always provide. The prairie did provide fuel. It simply did not always provide the kind anyone would have chosen first. In wooded regions, families could cut oak, hickory, cottonwood, or whatever local timber was available. Even then, firewood required land access, tools, strength, transport, and time. A tree standing several miles away was not yet heat. It had to be felled, trimmed, cut into stove lengths, split, hauled home, stacked, and dried. On open grassland, the distance between the cabin and a useful stand of trees could make wood an expensive luxury. A family might buy it, trade for it, travel far to gather it, or reserve it for moments when other fuels were unsuitable. So settlers learned to burn the landscape in less obvious forms. Corncobs were among the most convenient. After kernels had been removed for food, feed, or sale, the dry cobs remained. They were light, easy to handle, and eager to catch fire. A basket of them could wake a cold stove quickly. They could also disappear with astonishing speed. Corncobs made lively flames and fast heat, useful for boiling water or warming the room after dawn. They were less impressive when asked to maintain a fire through a long night. Feed the stove carelessly, and an entire basket could become ash before breakfast ended. Cornstalks presented the same bargain. They were available after harvest, but bulky, awkward, and quick burning. Gathering them required labour after the corn itself had already demanded planting, cultivating, cutting, husking, and storage. Nothing about free fuel was free. Hay covered the plains in enormous quantities, but loose grass burned too quickly to be practical unless a person stood beside the stove feeding it constantly. Settlers twisted hay into dense ropes or packed it into specially designed feeders. Tighter material admitted less air and burned more slowly. Making that fuel was another winter account paid in advance. Hands gathered the hay, shaped it, twisted it, and stacked the finished bundles under protection. Hours of preparation disappeared in minutes once the weather became severe. Then there were buffalo chips. The name made them sound almost festive. They were the dried droppings of bison, collected on treeless country by emigrants, freighters, soldiers, and other travellers long before permanent settlement covered much of Nebraska. Once dried by the plains sun, They could be clean to handle and nearly odorless. They burned with little flame, but formed hot coals useful for heating and cooking. They were not a comic invention of desperate homesteaders. They were a proven fuel system shaped by the absence of trees. By the time many permanent settlers arrived, the great bison herds had been devastated. Cattle supplied a replacement. Texas herds moved through Nebraska and occupied ranch country. According to later Nebraska accounts, some homesteaders welcomed trail bosses who allowed cattle to bed down on their land because the deposit left behind could become part of the winter fuel reserve. It was hospitality with a heating plan. Cow chips were gathered, dried, carried home, and stored where moisture could not ruin them. Children could help because the pieces were light and scattered across the ground. A dry chip produced useful heat. A damp one produced disappointment, smoke, and a smell that encouraged everyone to inspect the chimney, whether the chimney deserved it or not. Moisture degraded almost every fuel available to the household. That made storage part of the heating system. Wood left uncovered absorbed rain or snow. Fuel placed against damp ground could rot or soften. A poorly ventilated stack trapped moisture. A roof leak over the fuel supply was almost as serious as a leak over the bed. Dry material was needed near the stove, but bringing too much indoors introduced dirt, insects, odours, and fire risk. Hay, stalks, cobs, chips, and kindling could ignite from a spark. A crowded room did not offer a generous, safe storage district. Fuel therefore moved through stages. The main reserve remained outside or under shelter. A smaller quantity waited near the cabin. A still smaller amount came indoors to warm and dry before use. The best kindling stood ready for morning. This arrangement worked until a blizzard covered the pile, froze the door, or made the short distance outdoors dangerous. A fuel stack 20 steps from the cabin seemed conveniently close in autumn. In blowing snow, those 20 steps could disappear into whiteness. Wind erased tracks, snow entered collars, sleeves, boots, and every opening clothing had failed to defend. A person returning with one armful had spent body heat to retrieve stove heat. That exchange shaped every trip. Some households burned prairie roots or brush. Others purchased coal when transport and money allowed it. Coal offered concentrated heat and could burn longer than many improvised fuels. It also had to be mined, moved, sold, bought, carried, and stored. A family short of cash might know perfectly well that coal was useful. Knowledge did not place it beside the stove. In emergencies, almost anything combustible became subject to inspection. Broken furniture, damaged boxes, scraps of lumber, old fence rails, wooden handles, and building offcuts could all represent stored warmth. Burning them solved the immediate problem by creating another one. A chair became heat, but the room lost a chair. A fence rail warmed breakfast, but livestock discovered the revised boundary. A tool handle produced a brief fire and a longer inconvenience. This was survival at its least romantic, converting tomorrow's usefulness into tonight's warmth. Different fuels changed how the stove behaved. Wood created one pattern of flame, and coal's cobs produced another. Hay demanded frequent feeding. Dried manure burned with little blaze and strong heat. Coal required its own draft and ash management. The person tending the stove learned these personalities. A quick fuel could raise the room's temperature rapidly, then leave it falling just as quickly. Slow coals offered stability, but might not provide the fierce heat needed for cooking. Mixing fuels often worked better than relying on one alone. Kindling woke the fire. Cobs strengthened it. Wood or coal sustained it. Hay and chips stretched what remained. The exact mixture depended on place, season, household resources, and what had not already been consumed. By midwinter, the fuel pile became a calendar. At first, it looked reassuringly large. Then a hollow appeared where the driest material had been taken. The stack lowered. Better pieces vanished. Awkward scraps moved to the front. Fuel, once considered poor, began to look respectable. A mild week meant slower burning and fewer trips outside. A hard wind drove cold through the walls and demanded more heat. Cooking bread required a particular fire. Washing required hot water. Drying soaked clothing claimed warmth that might otherwise have lasted into the night. Every domestic act carried a fuel price. The stove consumed the summer one bundle at a time. It accepted corncobs, roots, hay, manure, wood, coal, labour, and money, then returned warmth only while the supply continued. And now the household faced an awkward choice. The same fire needed to keep the room livable and prepare every meal. Sometimes those duties wanted entirely different things. A room that needed warming preferred a steady fire. A breakfast that needed cooking often demanded a hot one. The difference sounds small until the household has only one stove, a limited fuel supply, and several people waiting to eat. In the coldest hour before sunrise, the first purpose of the fire was obvious. The room had to become livable. Fast-burning cobs, kindling, or twisted hay could raise the temperature quickly. The iron expanded with small ticks. Frost softened on the window. Clothing hanging nearby lost some of its stiffness. Then a pot went over the hottest part of the stove. The fire was no longer simply warming the room. It had been given a schedule. Water needed to boil. Cornmeal needed stirring. Bacon, when available, needed frying. Bread dough might need baking. A kettle of beans begun the previous day might need to return to a slow simmer. Each task required a different kind of heat. Boiling water wanted strength. Beans wanted patience. Bread wanted stability. Meat could tolerate neither a cold pan nor an inattentive cook. Coffee, or whatever substitute the household was calling coffee that morning, needed enough heat to provide at least the illusion that the day had begun properly. The stove offered no numbered settings. There was no small flame, medium flame, or convenient oven temperature marked on a dial. Heat was judged by experience, the sound of fat in a pan, the speed of bubbles around a kettle, the colour and smell of bread, the behaviour of the draft, and the kind of fuel inside the box. A practiced cook learned where the stove was hottest. Directly over the firebox, a pot might boil fiercely. Farther away, the same pot could simmer. A pan moved across the iron top, the way a modern cook might turn a control. The stove had settings. They were measured in inches. This made the entire surface valuable. One area held a kettle, another supported a skillet. A pot waited near the edge. Breakfast became a small act of traffic management. The cook shifted pans, fed fuel, stirred food, checked the oven, moved drying clothing, and discouraged children from leaning against hot iron. Meanwhile, a door opened for the first trip to the barn, sending a wave of cold air across the floor. The stove responded by being asked to work harder. Cooking could overheat the space nearest it, while the far side of the room remained uncomfortable. A person stirring porridge might feel flushed in the face and cold at the ankles. Someone beside the wall could still keep a blanket around the shoulders. Food choices reflected that geography. Meals that cooked for hours consumed fuel. Tough meat, dried beans, and some grains became tender only after patient heat. These were economical foods in one sense, and expensive in another. A cheap ingredient could have a high stove cost. Families reduced that cost where they could. Beans might be soaked before cooking. Pots could be covered. Food might begin over strong heat and then move to a cooler part of the stove. Residual warmth after bread baking could cook or dry something else. After the oven-baked bread, its declining warmth might dry fruit, warm plates, or help a slow dish continue cooking. A kettle remained on the stove so hot water would be available. Clothing hung nearby to capture warmth already escaping into the room. Efficiency came from a person constantly noticing what else the fire could do. Nebraska cooking did not always begin with a polished iron stove. Annie Ducker, who came to Custer County in 1873, later recalled that her family baked for several months in a hole dug into the side of an earth bank, with a fire built inside. Other settlers used outdoor fire trenches in summer. Such arrangements saved the small house from excess heat when weather allowed it. Winter removed that option. The cook worked beside the beds, stored clothing, tools, children, and everything else that absorbed smoke and smell. Bacon announced itself to the entire household. So did burned bread. Bread was especially demanding. It required flour or meal, liquid, salt when available, leavening, time for preparation, and an oven hot enough to bake without scorching the outside or leaving the centre heavy. A cook could not see through an iron oven door. Opening it released heat. Checking too often changed the conditions being checked. Judgment came through timing, smell, memory, and familiarity with the stove. A different fuel changed the result. A hard wind altered the draft. Green cottonwood might dry near or even inside the oven before it became useful in the fire, turning the stove into a place where tomorrow's fuel borrowed heat from today's meal. Other meals made fewer demands. Cornmeal mush required little elegance. Potatoes could be boiled, baked, fried, or placed near heat. Salt pork added fat and flavour in small amounts. Soup accepted leftovers with a hospitality rarely found elsewhere in the household. The pot became a place where small quantities could cooperate. A bone, an onion, a handful of beans, dried herbs, a piece of meat, and water might become supper. The result varied from nourishing to memorable for the wrong reasons, but warmth improved almost everything. Even a plain hot meal changed the room. Steam rose, metal spoons clicked against bowls, people moved closer to the table. For a short time, the fire's cost became visible as comfort. Cooking also produced moisture. Boiling kettles, simmering pots, wet clothing, and human breath added water to the air. That moisture condensed on cold surfaces, windows frosted, walls dampened. Bedding near an exterior wall could feel clammy. The family needed hot food, yet making it could make the shelter wetter. Opening the door or allowing ventilation released moisture, smoke, and odours. It also released heat. Again, the cabin chose nothing for them. The people inside chose which loss they could afford. On a milder winter day, the room might need only modest heat while cooking still demanded flame. Preparing a large meal could make the area near the stove stifling. The door might open briefly, spending fuel to produce heat and then allowing part of that heat to escape. It was not careless waste. It was the price of cooking inside the same small space used for sleeping. Meals also had to fit the labour schedule. Animals needed feeding before anyone sat down. Water might be late. A damaged harness could delay the person expected to carry fuel. If weather disrupted chores, breakfast waited. If the fire failed, everything waited. The stove became the household clock because daily life followed its readiness. Morning began when it caught. Meals began when it heated. Washing began when it warmed water. Bedtime began when the final fuel was arranged. This dependence exposed the next limit. Food could be stretched. Fuel could be mixed. Clothing could be layered. Privacy could be politely ignored. Water was less willing to compromise. It had to be found, carried, thawed, heated, used, and kept from freezing again. Every warm cup began as another weight brought through the door. The weight of water was felt before anyone drank it. A bucket had to be lifted, carried, guarded from spilling, and brought through a doorway that immediately released some of the warmth the stove had worked to create. In mild weather, this was ordinary labour. In deep winter, it became a negotiation with ice. The nearest source might be a well, spring, creek, river, cistern, or barrel. Each offered a different inconvenience. A well could freeze around the pump or rope. A creek might lie beneath thick ice. A spring could remain open but sit at the bottom of a slippery path. Snow was everywhere, but snow was mostly air and disappointment. A potful of it melted into surprisingly little water. A household surrounded by white fields could still spend hours obtaining enough liquid for drinking, cooking, animals, washing, and cleaning. Snow could help in an emergency, but melting it consumed fuel and produced water that might carry dirt, soot, grass, or whatever had landed there before anyone called it pure. Fresh snow looked innocent. The kettle sometimes disagreed. Where a well remained usable, a person still had to leave the cabin. Boots went on, layers followed, mittens that had finally dried returned to service. Empty buckets went out and full ones came home, carried slowly because spilled water froze on clothing and the ground. Water was divided into loads because nobody could persuade it to become lighter. The trip also had to be timed. Fetch water too early, and some might freeze before use. Wait too long, and cooking stalled. If a storm approached, extra containers needed filling while the path remained visible. If an animal trough froze, the household's water problem expanded beyond the walls. Livestock drank in quantities that made the family wash basin look modest. A cow, horse, or team of oxen could not be sustained on good intentions, and a cup passed around politely. Ice had to be broken. Water had to be carried, pumped, or made accessible. The animal in the barn represented milk, transport, field labour, meat, breeding stock, or money. Its thirst therefore entered the household economy. Water carried to livestock was not separate from water carried to the stove. Both required the same backs, hands, daylight, and weather. Inside, the family tried to keep a working supply liquid. A bucket placed near the stove remained usable but occupied valuable warm space. Set too close and it became an obstacle. Set too far away and a thin film of ice might form across the surface. Overnight, a forgotten pail could freeze hard enough that morning began with an argument between iron, ice, and patience. Warm water was more expensive still. It required cold water already hauled indoors, a container, stove space, and fuel. Every basin represented several earlier tasks that disappeared the moment a cloth entered it. This changed the meaning of cleanliness. A modern person can turn a handle and receive hot water with almost insulting speed. In the cabin, washing began long before water touched skin. It had to be fetched, heated, guarded from spills, and later carried away. People washed, but the frequency and volume varied with labour, weather, fuel, household custom, and available water. Hands and faces received regular attention. Clothing was cleaned when the work of heating, rinsing, wringing, and drying could be fitted around everything else. A fuller wash demanded planning and as much privacy as the room could manufacture. A tub or basin placed near the stove occupied part of the same floor used for beds, meals, and repairs. Water was heated in batches and mixed to a tolerable temperature. Other family members turned away, found chores, or cooperated with the social fiction that the room had briefly developed walls. The arrangement was not evidence that dirt went unnoticed. It showed how hauling every gallon changed the meaning of waste. Laundry required a larger campaign. Clothing absorbed sweat, smoke, grease, mud, animal smells, food, and the general atmosphere of a room in which nearly every activity occurred. Washing meant soaking, heating, rubbing, scrubbing, rinsing, wringing, and drying. In winter, the last stage created another problem. Wet fabric held a remarkable amount of water. Hung indoors, it released that moisture into the room. Windows frosted more heavily. Walls grew damp. Bedding could absorb the humid air. Clothing near the stove dried faster, but too much fabric crowded around hot iron increased the danger of scorching or fire. A pair of wool stockings might steam beside the stove while the far side of the room remained cold enough for dampness to linger all day. The door or window could be opened to release moisture. It would also release the heat just purchased with fuel and labour. Laundry days were therefore shaped by weather, stove use, available water, and the number of garments that could be hung without turning the cabin into a forest of damp cloth. Dishwashing followed the same logic on a smaller scale. Grease needed warm water. Scraps had to be removed. Utensils were wiped, rinsed, scraped, or scalded according to need and means. Water that had served one task might be used for another before it went outside. Even dirty water retained value until its final usefulness had been exhausted. Wastewater could not remain in the room. A basin had to be lifted and carried out carefully. Spill it on an earth floor, and the result was mud. Spill it on boards, and moisture entered cracks or froze near the door. Throw it repeatedly beside the house, and ice accumulated where people walked. The household developed a geography of disposal as well as supply. The 14 by 16-foot Palmer cabin makes the problem visible. Place a stove, bedstead, table, trunks, chairs, food, and several people inside that footprint. Then add a water bucket, a laundry basin, and a line of wet clothing. Water did not merely enter the room, it took possession of space. Illness raised the demand precisely when the household might have fewer healthy hands. A person with fever needed drink, washing, clean cloths, and perhaps more frequent attention. Childbirth required water. A burn from the stove demanded care. One person unable to carry a bucket made every bucket heavier for somebody else. That was the recurring pattern of winter life. A basic need became a chain of dependent labour. Break one link, and the burden shifted rather than vanished. By evening, containers were filled for the night when possible. A kettle remained warm. Drinking water stood where it could be reached without crossing the room in darkness. Wet floors were dried. Damp clothing was turned. The last wastewater went outside. The stove had heated the room, cooked the meals, and warmed the day's water. The fuel pile had paid for all three. Beside the wall, in sacks, crocks, bins, and barrels, the food supply was beginning to reveal the same uncomfortable truth. What looked plentiful in autumn became very small when divided by the number of meals still waiting before spring. The pantry did not become smaller all at once. It changed through subtraction. 1 scoop of flour, 3 potatoes, a strip of salt pork, a handful of beans, another measure of cornmeal. Day after day, the household removed amounts too ordinary to seem alarming. Then somebody looked into a barrel and saw the bottom. Winter food had to survive several enemies before it reached the table. Moisture encouraged mold. Warmth caused spoilage. Freezing damaged some foods and preserved others. Mice needed no invitation. Insects could arrive hidden inside grain. A poorly sealed crock admitted air, dirt, or something more determined. Food occupied whatever places protected it best. Potatoes, turnips, carrots, and other roots preferred cool darkness. They might be stored in a cellar, pit, box, or protected corner where they would not freeze solid. Onions and herbs could hang in bundles. Beans and grain waited in sacks or bins. Salted meat rested in barrels or crocks. Dried fruit, when available, remained precious because sweetness and variety both became scarce. Throwing food away was painful. Eating spoiled food could be worse. Preservation was a form of delayed judgment. Meat had been salted, smoked, dried or packed months earlier, often under conditions that varied from household to household. Fruit might have been sliced and dried in warm air. Corn had been shelled or ground. Beans hardened in their pods before being gathered and stored. The winter table was filled with summer transformed. What it lacked was freshness. For long stretches, meals repeated themselves. Cornmeal mush in the morning, bread or biscuits when flour allowed, beans, potatoes, or salt meat later, soup made from bones and scraps, leftovers adjusted just enough to appear as a different meal. Hunger appreciates creativity but does not require it. Cornmeal was especially useful. Kept dry, it could become mush, bread, cakes, or a thickener. Wheat flour offered more possibilities, but depended on supply, milling, transport, price, and local harvests. A sack of flour was not merely food. It was bread that had not yet demanded fuel. Every loaf still required water, mixing, time, and controlled heat. Cornmeal mush used less complicated fire. Beans required longer cooking but offered substance. Potatoes could be boiled, baked, fried, or added to soup. The family chose not only what it wanted to eat, but what the stove could afford to prepare. Salt pork brought fat, flavour, and calories. It also brought salt in quantities that made water more desirable. A small piece could season a large pot. Rendered fat could fry food or enrich something otherwise plain. Meat was not always an unlimited centerpiece. It often functioned as an ingredient whose influence travelled farther than its size. A bone could enter the pot more than once. First it flavoured broth, then it might be cracked or boiled again. By the time it was discarded, the household had asked nearly everything of it except conversation. Milk, butter, and eggs depended on animals continuing to produce through winter. Cold, poor feed, illness, age, or stress reduced that production. A cow giving less milk changed breakfast, baking, and the nutrition available to children. Chickens sometimes laid fewer eggs as daylight shortened. The family still fed them while receiving less in return, an arrangement familiar to anyone who has maintained an unprofitable employee out of hope. But hunting was not a magical solution waiting beyond the door. A person could spend calories walking, tracking, waiting, and returning with nothing. Ammunition cost money. A storm made travel dangerous. Wild animals were not obliged to appear because the flour barrel was low. The reliable winter diet was built from what had already been secured. This made counting important. A careful family estimated how much remained and how long it had to last. Exact calculation was difficult because spring did not arrive according to the pantry. A late storm could delay travel, planting, grazing, or access to supplies. Roads might become impassable during snow and nearly as difficult during mud. Rationing had to account for uncertainty. Adults sometimes reduced their own portions when stores tightened. Children still needed food to grow. Anyone performing hard outdoor labour needed calories simply to remain warm and useful. Cold increased appetite because the body itself was burning fuel. The stove consumed wood, hay, coal, cobs, or chips. The people consumed corn, beans, fat, meat, and bread. Both fires had to be maintained. A poorly fed person worked more slowly, became colder more easily, and recovered less well from illness. Yet every larger portion removed something from a later meal. Rationing rarely appeared as the dramatic division of a final crust. Usually it was a thinner slice, less fat in the pan, another bowl of soup, or meat cut small enough to be present in theory throughout the pot. Children noticed. They knew when syrup disappeared, when biscuits became less frequent, when the good potatoes were gone, and when adults claimed not to be hungry. The household could disguise scarcity through preparation, but not forever. Food also carried social meaning. A visitor arriving during winter might be offered something, despite the strain on supplies. Hospitality protected relationships, dignity, and the expectation that help moved in both directions. The guest who ate today might bring news, labour, seed, medicine, or assistance tomorrow. Refusing food preserved the pantry. Sharing it preserved the community. Uriah and Mattie Oblinger's letters from Nebraska repeatedly returned to crops, livestock, weather, prices, improvements, and money. Those records expose a reality hidden by the word pantry. Food security depended on fields, markets, animals, credit, transportation, and labour long before a meal appeared on the table. A bad crop was not only a smaller harvest. Low prices could make a decent harvest less useful. A healthy animal could become food, milk, work power, or cash. A dead one removed several protections at once. By late winter, the pantry changed character. The best vegetables had been eaten. The most convenient cuts of meat were gone. Dried foods hardened. The supply became less varied and more revealing. A nearly empty barrel showed scratches on its sides. A sack that once required 2 hands could be lifted easily. Crocks stood in the same places while holding less. The room did not appear dramatically different. Its future, had simply become lighter. Meals continued because they had to. The pot was stirred, bread was cut, the last useful fat was scraped from a pan, bowls were filled according to age, labour, health, and the private decisions of the person serving. Then the family sat together within the warmest part of the room. They ate close enough to hear every spoon, every cough, and every attempt not to look at another person's portion. One stove had forced their work into the same circle. Now the shrinking pantry pulled their bodies closer still. Closer was often warmer. In a one-room house, distance from the stove could be measured in comfort, health, age, and responsibility. The warmest sleeping place did not automatically belong to the strongest adult. It might go to a baby, an ill child, an older relative, or anyone whose condition made cold more dangerous. A person expected to rise before dawn might sleep where dressing and reaching the stove required less movement through darkness. These decisions were practical, but they were also personal. One person slept nearest the draught. Another occupied the edge of the bed. Someone shared a blanket with a restless child. Generosity felt nobler before another person's cold feet arrived. Beds consumed an enormous part of the room. A wooden bedstead offered elevation above a cold floor and space beneath for trunks, tools, clothing, food, or objects that had no better home. Not every household possessed enough bedsteads for everyone. Children might share beds. Adults could share with younger family members. Pallets, straw mattresses, or ticks filled with corn husks, grass, wool, feathers, or other available material could be spread on the floor at night and moved during the day. The room expanded only when everyone packed part of it away. Bedding carried much of the defence against night cold. Blankets, quilts, coverlets, hides, coats, and spare clothing could all become layers. A quilt represented cloth saved over time, pieces cut and joined, batting arranged, and long hours of stitching. It might also represent several earlier lives. A patch could have come from a worn dress, a child's shirt, an old work garment, or fabric purchased for another purpose and used until it could serve only in smaller pieces. The completed quilt held warmth because someone had refused to consider worn cloth useless. At bedtime, layers were arranged according to need. Too little covering meant cold. Too much heavy bedding could become uncomfortable, especially for small children. Damp bedding was worse than either. Moisture from leaks, wet clothing, breathing, or condensation reduced warmth and demanded stove heat the following day. Beds near exterior walls could feel especially cold. A sleeper might sense the chill through the wall, even without a clear draft. Frost formed nearby. Bedding pushed tightly against a damp surface absorbed moisture. The preferred location was close enough to benefit from the stove, but far enough to avoid sparks, scorching, or unbearable heat when the fire was strongest. That narrow territory was valuable. George Palmer's original Nebraska cabin measured 14 feet by 16 feet. Place one bedstead against a wall, add a table, stove, trunks, chairs, tools, hanging food, fuel, and a family. The remaining floor becomes less a room than a sequence of negotiated passages. The National Park Service now uses that cabin to ask visitors to imagine a large family occupying the space. The exercise works because the dimensions remove abstraction. 224 square feet do not allow many private decisions. Families sometimes used curtains or hanging cloth to create a suggestion of separation around a bed. Such barriers could soften drafts and offer limited privacy. They could also restrict heat and collect dust. Privacy was less a wall than a group agreement. Changing clothes required timing and cooperation. Washing demanded more. Illness, childbirth, nursing infants, and the ordinary requirements of the body all took place inside a space also used for cooking, eating, repairing tools, and receiving visitors. A knock at the door could begin a sudden transformation. Bedding was adjusted, clothing was gathered, a curtain was pulled. The room became respectable at a speed suggesting that respectability had been waiting nearby in a folded condition. The arrival of a guest made the cabin more crowded, but refusing shelter during severe weather could be dangerous. A traveller, neighbour, or relative might need warmth, food, and a place to sleep. The household responded by compressing itself again. Children shifted together. Adults took less comfortable places. A pallet appeared where the table had stood. Coats became blankets. The guest received what could be spared, partly from kindness and partly because a different storm might reverse the roles. Hospitality was an informal insurance system, with supper included. Babies made the room feel smaller in another way. They needed warmth, feeding, washing, and attention at hours that did not respect the labour schedule. Their cries woke everyone because there was nowhere for sound to go. An infant near the stove had to be protected from cold and heat. Bedding could not sit carelessly beside iron. A cradle, basket, box, or shared bed occupied space already claimed by something else. Older children adapted to the room's rules. They learned where not to step in darkness, which object made noise, how close they could approach the stove, and whether the blanket they were pulling belonged partly to somebody else. They also learned that a bed was not private property in the modern sense. It was household equipment. During illness, the warmest bed might change occupants. During a storm, several people could gather under the same coverings. When a visitor stayed, sleeping arrangements shifted. When bedding needed drying or repair, the night's entire order changed. Clothing followed the same principle. Garments passed between siblings. Coats covered sleepers. A shawl belonged to one person until another needed it more urgently. Mittens disappeared into general use and returned with uncertain ownership. In a small household, objects developed communal careers. The cabin was rarely silent. Wind pressed against walls. The stove ticked. Fuel settled. A child turned. An animal moved outside. Snow slipped from the roof. A kettle or cup was disturbed in darkness. People snored, whispered, dreamed, breathed heavily, and occasionally claimed to have been awake all night because of someone who insisted they had made no sound at all. Rest was shared, but sleep remained individual. A person rising to tend the stove could wake others. Opening the iron door introduced a brief glow. Fuel shifted. Cold air entered when the first outdoor chore began. The needs of the household crossed every bed. The strongest adult might be required for outdoor work. The person who cooked needed rest before morning. A nursing mother faced different demands. An older child could help with fuel or younger siblings. Illness removed one worker and redistributed every task. Sleeping arrangements reflected tomorrow's labour as much as tonight's temperature. The room became a map of responsibility. Nearest the stove lay vulnerability. Near the door waited duty. Along the walls rested storage, bedding, and people who had accepted the colder positions. Overhead hung clothing and objects drying in the rising warmth. At the centre, the table waited to reclaim the floor by morning. Then the first sleeper woke. Perhaps the fire had weakened. Perhaps an animal called outside. Perhaps the body simply knew the hour before light. Cold clothing was found in the dark. Quilts shifted. One pair of feet touched the floor. The sleeping room began turning back into a workplace. The first sleeper did not wake because the day had begun. The day began because somebody woke. Before dawn, the cabin was still a bedroom. Bedding covered much of the floor. Clothing hung from pegs. The table might have been pushed aside to make space for pallets. Ash lay inside the stove, and whatever warmth remained had settled into quilts, mattresses, and the bodies beneath them. Then one person stood and changed the purpose of the room. The fire came first. Coals were stirred, kindling arranged, and fuel added in stages. A kettle followed. While the stove warmed, bedding was folded, shaken or stacked, pallets disappeared, the table returned to the centre, boots were found, children were roused according to age, patience, and the urgency of the morning. Within minutes, the bedroom became a kitchen. The transformation was not elegant. A child searched for a stocking beneath a blanket being folded. A chair blocked the stove door. A bucket occupied the exact patch of floor where someone wanted to stand. One room required choreography. It did not always receive it. Breakfast had to be prepared while outdoor work was already waiting. Animals needed feed and water. Snow might have to be cleared from the door. Ice could cover the well, pump, trough, or all three. A storm might have shifted a fence, buried a path, or packed snow against the barn. The person leaving first dressed near the stove when possible. Cold trousers and a stiff coat were warmed just enough to become tolerable. Boots were checked for dampness. Mittens went on. Then the door opened, and the room lost part of the heat everyone had just created. Outdoor chores could not be postponed until the weather became pleasant. Livestock ate according to hunger, not temperature. A cow still needed milking. Horses or oxen required feed. Chickens needed attention even if winter had persuaded them to produce almost nothing useful. The animals had their own bedding, waste, illnesses, injuries, and inconvenient opinions. A frightened horse could damage a stall. A cow could kick over a bucket. Frozen harness leather could crack. Snow drifted through openings that had seemed small in autumn. Water carried to a trough might begin freezing before the person carrying it returned indoors. Meanwhile, the cabin continued working without them. Breakfast was served. The youngest children were fed. Dishes were cleared or moved aside. The stove was adjusted for the next task. If bread was needed, dough might be mixed. If clothing required repair, sewing appeared on the table. If tools had broken, they competed for the same surface. The table belonged to whoever had the most urgent problem. A loose handle could not wait if the tool was needed outdoors. A torn mitten could not wait if a child had chores. Bread dough could not politely pause because somebody wanted to repair a harness buckle beside it. Domestic work and farm work are often described separately, as though one took place inside and the other began at the door. In winter, they collided around the stove. The person cooking watched the fuel. The person mending clothing listened for a child's cough. A return from the barn brought snow, mud, damaged equipment, or news of another task. A bucket needed filling. An animal might require care. A wet coat had to dry in the same space where food was being prepared. The family did not move through a list. It moved through interruptions. Children contributed as soon as they were able. The smallest carried light items, gathered cobs, watched younger siblings, or fetched objects from around the room. Older children might feed animals, haul water, clean, mend, cook, clear snow, or help with fuel. Their work was not always performed with the speed or enthusiasm adults considered reasonable. Without it, somebody else had to do more. Lessons, where they occurred at home, fitted themselves around labour. Reading, writing, sums, memorization, and religious instruction could take place at the same table used for every meal and repair. The child bent over a slate while bread rose nearby and wet clothing dripped onto the floor. Education did not require silence because silence was unavailable. The cabin offered wind, iron lids, spoons, coughing, livestock sounds, crying infants, and adults discussing matters children were expected not to hear despite sitting 6 feet away. Photographs made by Solomon D. Butcher in Nebraska's Custer County from the late 1880s onward preserve households posed beside sod houses, animals, tools, wagons, and possessions. The images are still arrangements for a camera, not unguarded daily life. Yet they reveal how closely labour, shelter, livestock, and family identity stood together. A household was photographed with the things that kept it working. Midday did not provide a clean pause. The meal was often simpler than the labour surrounding it. Leftovers returned, soup warmed, bread was cut. People ate in shifts if chores demanded it. Then the room became a workshop. Winter damaged everything slowly. Leather dried, wood shrank, metal rusted, handles loosened, soles wore thin, clothing tore at elbows, knees, cuffs, and every placework repeatedly applied pressure. Repair was cheaper than replacement. and replacement might be impossible until travel improved. A coat was patched because the person wearing it still had to go outside. A boot received another piece of leather. A tool handle was shaved, fitted, wrapped, or nailed. Harness was cleaned and treated when materials allowed. The household maintained objects because those objects maintained the household. Afternoon brought another round of animal care, fuel hauling, and water complace. The stove required feeding throughout it all. Ash might need removal. A pot needed stirring. Children grew tired. Adults did too, though winter granted no special value to the discovery. Fatigue made small tasks dangerous. A knife slipped. A bucket spilled. A stove lid was handled carelessly. A gate remained open. A food container was left uncovered. Too little fuel came indoors before dark. Winter punished distraction with remarkable efficiency. As daylight faded, the room became a kitchen again. Supper used whatever food, fuel, and patience remained. Wet garments gathered near the stove, tools were put away or left where morning would find them. Animals received a final check. Then washing began in small portions, hands and faces, a cloth over the table, bowls and spoons. Children prepared for bed while adults continued working around them. The room became a bedroom gradually. Pallets returned. Quilts unfolded. Chairs moved. Clothing was arranged for morning. Kindling was placed within reach. Water was set where it might remain liquid. The last fuel was selected for banking the fire. Even then, the day did not end. The latch was checked. Wind was listened to. A baby woke. A cough continued. The stove needed one more adjustment. Only after the room had been prepared to survive the night could the people inside attempt to sleep. Before many hours passed, one of them would rise again. The real winter schedule was fire, food, animals, water, repair, fire again, and whatever went wrong between them. The system worked only while enough people remained strong enough to keep it moving. Then one of them became ill. Illness did not need its own room. It entered the only room there was. A cough began near one bed and travelled through air already thick with stove heat, damp clothing, cooking steam, and the breath of everyone else. A fever appeared in a child who had slept beside two siblings. An adult returned from the barn with a cut hand, a twisted ankle, or a chest tightened by cold air. The problem could not be placed behind a closed door. There was no spare bedroom and no quiet corridor. The sick person rested among cooking, fuel hauling, children, repairs, and the iron stove opening and closing through the day. The warmest bed usually became the sick bed. That protected the patient and displaced another sleeper. A child moved to a pallet. An adult surrendered a blanket. The room rearranged itself because illness created a new centre of gravity. Everyone's work bent around it. A fever demanded water. Water had to be hauled. Cloths needed washing. Bedding might need drying. Food had to be made soft enough to eat. The stove burned longer because warmth mattered more, and because kettles, broth, and wash water claimed its surface. The patient did less. The rest did more. This was the hidden danger of sickness in a labour-tight household. The loss of one person's strength did not remove that person's tasks. It transferred them. If the usual water carrier became ill, another back took the load. If the cook could not stand, somebody learned quickly or served simpler meals. If the strongest adult could not reach the barn, children or neighbours took over work that weather had not agreed to postpone. One weak member could be supported. A second illness made the entire system fragile. Respiratory sickness was especially difficult in a crowded winter room. Smoke escaped poorly when the stove drew badly. Fine ash rose during cleaning. Damp air gathered around cold walls. Clothing dried near the fire. Doors remained closed because every opening released heat. The people inside wanted fresh air and needed warmth. Winter rarely offered both at the same price. The door could be opened briefly to clear smoke, but the room cooled at once. A patient already shivering did not welcome ventilation as an abstract principle. Yet smoke irritated eyes and lungs, and dampness settled into bedding and clothing. So the family adjusted, imperfectly. The door opened for a moment. The draft was corrected. A leaking pipe joint was watched. Wet garments were moved. Bedding was aired when weather allowed. Nothing became ideal. It became less dangerous. Cold could injure before illness began. Fingers and toes lost feeling during outdoor work. Wet socks turned a manageable chore into a serious risk. A person delayed by a broken harness, wandering animal, or buried path remained outside longer than planned. Returning indoors did not end the danger. Numb skin needed gradual warmth. Boots might have to come off before swelling made them difficult to remove. Wet layers were stripped away. The person required heat, food, and rest at the exact moment the household had expected more labour. The stove created injuries of its own. Hot iron burned instantly. A hand reaching for a lid without the proper tool could blister. A child stumbling nearby might touch the side or fall against it. Boiling water spilled, hot fat splashed, a skirt, sleeve, cloth, or piece of bedding could catch fire. The object protecting the family from winter remained dangerous. A small burn consumed water, clean cloth, time, and attention. A serious one could remove a worker for days. Infection turned an accident into something worse when clean dressings and medical help were limited. Cuts and punctures accompanied hard labour. Axes, knives, saws, needles, nails, wire, tools, animal horns and splintered wood all offered opportunities for injury. The cabin contained no emergency department. It contained a basin, cloth, whatever remedies the family trusted, and the judgment of people who might be frightened but still had chores waiting. Medicine could be purchased only if a store stocked it, the family could afford it, and somebody could reach the store. A doctor might live many miles away. Snow, darkness, mud, or distance turned a request for help into a dangerous journey of its own. Calling for assistance therefore began with calculation. Was the illness serious enough to send a person out? Could the cabin spare that worker? Would help be found? Could both return before the weather changed? The patient waited while those questions were answered. Childbirth exposed every limit of the one-room household. It required warmth, water, clean cloth, assistance, and as much privacy as the space could manufacture. Other family members might be sent to a neighbour, moved behind hanging cloth, or directed toward chores that suddenly took longer than usual. A midwife, experienced neighbour, relative, or physician might assist, depending on place and circumstance. Reaching the cabin could be difficult, and birth did not respect road conditions. The stove heated water. The table surrendered its usual duties. The bed became the entire world for a time. The Oblinger family's records preserve the cost with painful clarity. Mattie Oblinger died in childbirth in February 1880, along with her infant son. She was 36 and left Uriah with 3 young daughters. The loss was personal, but it was also structural. Uriah could not both maintain the farm and care for the household alone. He sold nearly all his possessions and moved to Minnesota, while the girls lived for a time with relatives. One event broke several parts of the system at once. Marriage, parenting, labour, income, home, and the family's place on the land. No invented dialogue is needed to make that history devastating. Children became sick, with no understanding of the household economy they disturb. They needed holding, watching, cleaning, and reassurance. A frightened child could not be ordered to recover because fuel was low. Somebody stayed awake. That person still faced morning. Night watches stretched the cabin thinner. The stove needed tending. The patient needed water. A cough changed. A fever rose or eased. Every sound from the bed gained importance. The room that normally made privacy difficult now made worry impossible to hide. Children heard whispered discussions. Adults noticed shrinking fuel. The sick person saw others taking over abandoned work. Even kindness carried a visible cost. Yet the same closeness offered one advantage. A patient was rarely entirely alone. Movement could be heard. Breathing could be noticed. Water could be offered. Bedding could be adjusted. Shared space meant shared exposure, but also constant observation. Recovery, when it came, was gradual. The patient sat up, ate something, took a small task, folded cloth, watched a child, mended an object from bed. Work returned before full strength because work had been waiting. Outside, the weather had continued arranging its own plans. Wind strengthened. Snow moved across the prairie in long, pale sheets. Paths began to disappear. The barn faded behind blowing white. Inside, one person remained weak. The fuel stack stood lower, and nobody could assume that tomorrow's water, food, or help would remain within reach. Then the storm closed the door for them. The storm did not arrive as a wall. It began with wind. At first, loose snow moved across the ground in thin white lines. It slipped around grass, fences, and wagon ruts, gathering wherever the land offered resistance. The sky lowered, the horizon softened. A person standing in the doorway could still see the barn, the fuel stack, and the path toward the well. An hour later, those objects looked farther away. By afternoon, they had disappeared. A blizzard on open prairie did not need to bury the cabin completely to make travel dangerous. Wind lifted fallen snow and drove it sideways until earth and sky became the same pale color. A fence 20 yards away could vanish. Tracks filled almost as soon as they were made. The world had not become empty. It had become unreadable. Families prepared when warning signs allowed it. Extra fuel came indoors. Water containers were filled. Animals were fed early. Loose objects near the house were secured or abandoned. Preparation helped. It did not prevent the storm from creating new work. Wind pressed cold air through every weak place in the cabin. Drafts sharpened beneath the door and around the window. The stove consumed fuel faster because the walls lost heat more quickly. Beds, cloth, sacks, or spare material moved toward the worst gaps. The stove door opened more often. Fuel went in. Ash came out. The damper shifted. The pipe was watched for smoke pushed backward by the wind. The fire needed enough air to burn and enough restraint to last. A roaring stove felt reassuring for 10 minutes. Then somebody looked at the indoor fuel pile and imagined the storm continuing for 3 days. Comfort became arithmetic again. Outside, animals remained the first unavoidable concern. A cow could not be explained into waiting until visibility improved. Horses still required feed. Chickens might survive a delayed visit, but keeping them alive mattered more than eggs. A person had to leave the cabin. Where a rope, fence, wall, or other guide connected the house to an outbuilding, it could provide direction after tracks vanished. Not every farm had such an aid. A familiar path was not enough when wind removed every landmark. Before opening the door, the person dressed carefully. Dry layers mattered. Mittens were secured. Cloth protected part of the face. The latch lifted. Snow entered immediately. It skittered across the floor, struck the stove, melted near the iron, and gathered against furniture. Cold air poured low into the room. The door closed as soon as the person cleared it. For those remaining, waiting became another kind of labor. They listened. Wind buried ordinary sounds. The barn might be close enough to reach in a minute, but minutes lengthened when nobody could see the person outside. A delay could mean a frozen latch, a frightened animal, a drift against the door, or nothing at all. At the barn, routine work became clumsy. Snow pressed through cracks. Water froze. Feed was difficult to reach. Animals grew nervous as wind made the structure groan. A cow might resist milking. A horse could crowd the door. A bucket slipped more easily in gloves. Bare fingers performed delicate work better and froze faster. The person finished what could be finished and turned toward the cabin. That return could be more dangerous than the outward trip. Wind shifted. Tracks were gone. The cabin no longer appeared where memory expected it. Walking directly against blowing snow could make a person angle away without realizing it. On open land, becoming lost did not require traveling far. A person could pass within yards of shelter and never see it. Inside, family members might strike metal, call through the doorway, or make whatever sound the wind allowed. Opening the door released heat, but leaving it closed could hide the cabin's only sign. Winter demanded a choice between losses. When the missing figure finally entered, the room changed at once. Snow came with them. Clothing steamed near the stove. Hands were examined, boots came off. The door was secured. Nobody celebrated for long. The storm altered food too. Cooking became simpler because every hot meal competed with the heating fire. Bread might be delayed. Long boiling dishes were reconsidered. The household used food requiring less stove time and fewer pots. Water was guarded carefully. If the well or pump became inaccessible, the indoor supply mattered. Snow could be melted, but doing so demanded fuel. A kettle packed with snow shrank into a shallow amount of water, as though the storm were charging an insulting exchange rate. Wet clothing multiplied. Every trip returned with snow in cuffs, collars, hems, and boot seams. Garments hung near the stove, adding moisture to the room. Floors became slick. Mittens dried slowly. A coat, needed for the next trip, might still be damp from the last one. Children stayed away from the door and took smaller tasks. They sorted fuel, watched a younger sibling, held cloth over a draft, or listened to adults discuss supplies in voices intended to sound ordinary. Children were very good at hearing fear disguised as planning. The fuel stack became the storm's clock. At first, the indoor pile looked sufficient. Then it lowered. More had to be fetched, perhaps from a stack already buried. Digging it free took time and energy. Loose cobs or chips scattered. Hay became damp. Wood froze together where snow had melted and hardened. By the second night, sleep came in fragments. The stove required tending. The roof demanded listening. Heavy drifting could load part of a structure unevenly. Wind worried at the stovepipe and rattled anything not firmly fixed. The family could not see what was happening outside. That uncertainty made every sound important. Nobody wanted to investigate unless necessary. The Oblinga correspondence records a Nebraska family repeatedly contending with blizzards, drought, grasshoppers, weak prices, and the ordinary demands of crops and livestock throughout the 1870s. The letters do not turn those hardships into one perfect cinematic storm. They reveal something more useful. Bad weather entered a continuing financial and domestic struggle. A blizzard arrived on top of whatever the family was already carrying. Inside the closed cabin, meals became smaller and warmer. Bedding moved closer together. The weak remained near the stove. Stories, prayer, quiet conversation, or simple work filled hours no longer organized by daylight in a familiar way. The room had become the entire visible world. Then, sometime after another long night, the sound changed. The wind weakened. Snow still moved, but the walls stopped trembling. Light at the window became steadier. The door opened carefully and met a drift packed against it like another wall. Beyond that drift, the land had been remade. Paths were gone. Fences vanished beneath ridges. The barn roof carried a heavy white load. The fuel pile had become a shape rather than a supply. The family had survived the closed world. Now it had to dig back into the larger one. And that larger world contained the thing pioneer stories most often leave outside the frame. Other people? Other people were often the difference between hardship and disaster. The pioneer cabin stood alone in photographs because photographs preferred a clear subject. The family did not necessarily live alone in practice. A neighbour might be a mile away. 5 miles away, or hidden beyond land that looked empty until somebody knew where to search. Roads could be little more than wagon tracks. Snow erased them, mud swallowed them. Distance still mattered. Distance was not the same as absence. Families watched smoke rising from neighbouring chimneys. They noticed when livestock wandered where it should not. They carried news from town, lent tools, exchanged food, shared work, and appeared at doors when weather or misfortune made ordinary independence impossible. The ideal pioneer was often described as self-reliant. The successful pioneer was usually connected. In a letter dated December 1, 1872, Uriah Oblinger described the young families settling around him in Nebraska. He found them generous, he wrote, and believed they would all be poor here together. The line was lightly humorous. It was also a survival arrangement. Shared poverty did not produce fuel automatically. It placed nearby households inside the same system of storms, broken tools, weak harvests, sick children, and urgent favours. Neighbours did not live in constant harmony. They argued over fences, animals, water, boundaries, politics, debts, religion, and methods of doing nearly everything. A borrowed tool could return damaged. A promise of labour might arrive late. Livestock showed little respect for property lines. Community was not perfect friendship. It was the recognition that one household could not own every skill, object, animal, and pair of hands it might suddenly need. Consider the stove. A damaged stovepipe, broken door, or cracked part could threaten the entire cabin. The family might lack the tools or experience to repair it. A neighbour who understood metalwork, masonry, carpentry, or the stubborn habits of that model became more useful than any heroic speech about independence. Assistance was often exchanged rather than purchased. One family helped butcher a hog, another repaired a roof. A team was loaned. Milk crossed a property line. Children stayed elsewhere while an adult travelled for help. Borrowing was not always a sign of failure. It was a survival technology without iron parts. The law itself recognised this dependence. When a homesteader was ready to prove a claim, 2 neighbours or friends had to sign the proof and vouch for the improvements. Ownership required witnesses. Tools circulated because they were expensive. One family might own a good saw, another a grain cradle, another a wagon strong enough for a particular journey. A household could not afford every object needed only occasionally. The owner lent the tool. The borrower returned it promptly, cleaned and unbroken, unless they wished to become the subject of conversation across several farms. Nothing moved through a small community faster than news of a damaged, borrowed tool. Food also crossed between households. A family with milk could trade for eggs. Meat might be exchanged for grain. Seed varieties passed from one farm to another. Preserved fruit, flour, coffee, salt or sugar were valuable not only for calories, but for relief from repetition. A family known never to help might find fewer people approaching when its barn burned, animals escaped, or illness reached the cabin. Reputation had practical weight. So did hospitality. A traveller caught in worsening weather might knock after dark. Turning that person away could expose them to injury or death. Allowing them inside meant another body, another portion of food, and another sleeping place in a room already full. The household compressed. Children shifted closer. Coats became bedding. The visitor ate what could be offered. In return came news of roads, weather, prices, sickness, missing animals, or families needing assistance. Information was one of the most useful things carried through the door. A warning that a store was low on flour could change when a family travelled. News of deep snow on a road prevented a wasted journey. A report that somebody was ill sent help in the right direction. So did the store. The general store was not merely a place for charming jars and conversation around another stove. It was a credit office, supply point, a news centre where shortages became painfully specific. A household might need flour, salt, lamp oil, nails, medicine, cloth, matches, or coal. The storekeeper might extend credit. Credit solved the immediate shortage by moving it into the future, where it became debt. A failed harvest or dead animal made repayment difficult. The family left with necessary goods and a new reason to worry. The mill created another dependency. Grain was not automatically flour or meal. It had to be ground at home in small quantities or taken to machinery capable of processing it more efficiently. Travel to a mill required time, transport, passable roads, and something to grind. A family might wait for suitable weather, then discover that several neighbours had made the same calculation. The flour barrel depended on fields, labour, machinery, roads, and other people. It was no monument to solitude. Churches and schools extended the network. They offered worship and education, but also places where families exchanged news, arranged help, formed friendships, discussed prices, and noticed absences. When a child failed to appear at school, or an entire family missed a gathering, somebody might ask why. That question could matter. Isolation became more dangerous when nobody knew a cabin was in trouble. People did not survive on calories and fuel alone. They needed evidence that the world had not narrowed permanently to one stove, one table, and the same few walls. Shared labour made that wider world visible. At a barn raising, harvest, butchering, quilting, or major repair, many hands completed work one family could not manage alone. Tasks divided, knowledge spread. There was food, conversation, rivalry, judgment, humour, and at least one person explaining that everybody else had chosen the wrong method. Human beings had reached the frontier without leaving human beings behind. Yet community had limits. A neighbour could lend fuel only if their own pile was sufficient. A store could offer flour only if wagons had delivered it. A doctor could help only if somebody reached them. During a broad storm, every household might be trapped at once. Some settlers lived so far apart that help arrived late or not at all. The myth of total self-reliance was false. So was the comforting idea that community could solve everything. Sometimes neighbours came, tools were borrowed, credit was extended, and the family worked with all the strength it possessed. Sometimes winter still took more than the household could replace. More than the household could replace did not always mean death. Sometimes it meant leaving. The decision rarely arrived in one dramatic moment. It accumulated through losses that looked manageable when considered separately. A cow died. A crop failed. A horse became lame. A child remained sick. Credit at the store tightened. The fuel stack fell below what the weather still demanded. Each event removed part of the family's ability to answer the next one. A poor harvest could be survived if livestock remained healthy. A dead animal could be absorbed if savings or neighbours filled the gap. Illness could be endured if enough workers stayed strong. Poor fuel could be stretched if the stove drew well and the roof held. Winter became dangerous when several protections failed together. The first response was adjustment. Meals grew thinner. Better food was reserved for children, the sick, or whoever performed the hardest outdoor work. Seed grain might be eyed as food, even though eating it solved hunger by threatening the next planting. Breeding animals could be slaughtered, exchanging future herds for present meat. Tools, cloth, furniture, or livestock might be sold. The family did not merely lose an object. It converted part of its future into enough cash or food to reach another week. That exchange continued only while something remained to sell. Debt offered another extension. A storekeeper, neighbour, relative, or lender might allow payment later. Credit kept flour in the barrel and fuel near the stove. It also tied the coming harvest to obligations created by the previous winter. Spring could arrive before the finances recovered from January. Some households began planting exhausted, underfed, short of seed, without sufficient animals, or already owing part of whatever the land might produce. Surviving winter did not mean escaping it. The season followed people into summer, as debt, weakness, damaged tools, lost livestock, and fields planted too late. Injury intensified the pressure. A broken leg, crushed hand, serious burn, or lingering illness could remove labour for weeks. The family might know exactly what needed doing and simply lack enough healthy people to do it. The culture of settlement admired endurance. Families had crossed long distances, invested savings, claimed land, built shelter, and written home about opportunity. Admitting that the farm was failing could feel like confessing a personal defect. The weather was not grading character. A blizzard did not spare the industrious. Drought did not inspect moral worth. Disease did not ask whether the cabin had been built by an optimist. Sometimes a household worked intelligently and still lost. The soil might be poor, rain might fail, grasshoppers could destroy crops, prices could fall, transportation costs consumed profits. A sequence of hard seasons reduced animals and savings faster than either could be rebuilt. The one-room cabin then became a trap of investment. Every wall represented labour already spent. The roof, stove, fencing, well, barn, and broken acres around it all argued for staying. Leaving meant abandoning not only a place, but years of effort that could not be packed into a wagon. This made people wait. They waited for one better harvest, one easier winter, one rise in prices, one healthy calf, one letter containing help. Hope was necessary. It was also capable of extending a bad decision. At some point, the question changed. It was no longer whether the claim could be saved. It was what could be saved from it. A family might move temporarily into a neighbour's home. Children could stay with relatives while adults worked elsewhere. One person might leave to earn wages. The household could return east, move into town, seek different land, or follow relatives to another settlement. A person could lose a farm and preserve a family. Frontier mythology preferred the cabin that remained. It paid less attention to the empty foundation, collapsed sod walls, or the family whose courage appeared as a wagon moving away. Leaving could be the most rational survival decision of the winter. The Oblinger correspondence records years of persistence without offering a simple triumph. Uriah and Matty worked their Nebraska land together for almost 7 years, while contending with blizzards, drought, grasshoppers, and low crop prices. After Matty's death in 1880, Uriah sold nearly everything and left. He later returned to Nebraska, tried Kansas, moved to Missouri, and started again more than once. The wider family record contains economic struggle, debt, separation, and lost land, alongside stubborn optimism. Survival did not move in a straight line towards success. Before departure, a household began dismantling itself. Useful boards came off sheds, nails were pulled and saved, furniture was sold or loaded, livestock was traded, food stores were gathered, bedding was rolled, the stove, if movable and worth transporting, became one of the most valuable objects in the room. The same iron box that had anchored the household now had to be disconnected, lifted, and carried elsewhere. An empty cabin cooled quickly. Without people tending the fire, frost spread across the room. The water bucket froze. The window whitened. Ash settled inside the stove for the last time. The building had not failed all at once. It had lost the human system that made it a home. There was a larger truth beneath these individual struggles. The land on which homesteaders built was not unclaimed merely because federal maps offered parcels and legal papers described them as available. Native nations had lived, travelled, hunted, farmed, traded, and maintained relationships with these places long before settler cabins appeared. Federal expansion, treaties made and broken, forced removals, military campaigns, reservation policies, and the destruction of bison herds helped create the conditions in which settlers received or purchased land. The hardship inside the cabin was real, so was the dispossession outside it. Holding both facts prevents the winter story from becoming a comforting tale in which empty land tested brave newcomers. The land was not empty. The history was crowded long before the cabin was built. Even among settlers, opportunity was unequal. Money, citizenship, race, gender, family structure, language, military service, social connections, and access to markets shaped who could claim land, secure credit, obtain tools, and recover from loss. Toughness explained far less than later stories pretended. By late winter, a struggling family might count fuel by armfuls and food by meals. Livestock looked thinner. Clothing had been patched over earlier patches. Everyone knew which objects could be sold, burned, eaten, or left behind. Then the weather offered its cruelest trick. A mild afternoon arrived. Water dripped from the roof. Snow softened near the door. Sunlight entered at a higher angle, and for several hours spring seemed close enough to trust. The family loosened its layers. The stove burned gently. Somebody stepped outside and heard water moving beneath the snow. Then the temperature fell again. The softened surface hardened into ice. Wind returned. Another snowfall covered the brief evidence of change. But the evidence had existed. Winter was dangerous, still hungry, and still capable of taking more. It was no longer endless. Inside the cabin, the family looked at the remaining fuel, the remaining food, and the thin light reaching farther across the floor. The question had narrowed. Could those supplies outlast the final cold? The final part of winter was often the most deceptive. The days were longer, but the nights still froze. Sunlight softened the surface of the snow, then darkness hardened it again. Roofs dripped at noon and carried icicles by morning. A path cleared one afternoon became a polished strip of ice before breakfast. Spring appeared in fragments. The family could see it without yet being able to use it. The pantry remained nearly empty. The fuel stack did not grow because the sun stayed up longer. Livestock still needed feed. Roads alternated between snow, ice, and mud. The ground beneath the white surface remained locked. This was not the moment to become careless. A household that had rationed through months of cold could still run short during the final weeks. The remaining supplies were often the least convenient: damp fuel, damaged vegetables, tough cuts of meat, grain that required sorting, and scraps once saved for emergencies. The emergency had arrived slowly enough to resemble ordinary life. Fuel came indoors piece by piece. The last straight sticks were mixed with cobs, chips, stalks, or twisted hay. Broken wooden objects were reconsidered. A damaged stool might lose a leg to the stove. A box that had protected supplies all winter could become heat once there was almost nothing left to store inside it. Burning part of the household felt wasteful, but freezing beside intact furniture would have been a strange victory for good housekeeping. The stove was used differently now. During the hardest cold, it had burned almost continuously. As daylight strengthened, the family allowed the fire to weaken during warmer hours. Cooking and heating were combined more tightly. Bread was baked when the room needed warmth, water heated while meals cooked, clothing dried in the heat that remained afterward. No useful warmth left the iron without being asked to perform another task. At night, the fire was still banked, the room still cooled. Somebody still woke before dawn and searched beneath ash for red coals. Morning no longer felt quite as hostile. Frost on the window grew thinner. Clothing left near the wall was cold rather than rigid. Light entered earlier, revealing the same worn floor, patched bedding, and faces made leaner by the season. The people had changed with the room. Children carried fuel more carefully, recognized the sound of a weak fire, and understood why the door should not remain open. Older children had taken on work when illness or exhaustion removed adults from the schedule. Adults knew the exact measure of what remained. A sack announced its remaining meals by weight. A dark section of the fuel pile warned of dampness. The stove could be read from the colour of coals and the quiet pull of the draught. These were not grand frontier talents. They were intimate forms of attention. Survival depended on noticing small changes while there was still time to answer them. A draught felt stronger. A child ate less. A cow moved stiffly. A roof beam sounded different. A sack became easier to lift. A cough lasted one day too long. The responses were not always perfect. Bread burned. Fuel became wet. Animals escaped. Tempers failed. A bucket was forgotten. More flour was used than intended. A repair waited until winter demonstrated why it should not have. Real families made mistakes inside real weather. Endurance was not flawless discipline. It was continuing after ordinary failure without allowing it to become final. Then came the first day when the stove was allowed to go cold for several hours. No ceremony marked it. The morning fire cooked breakfast and warmed the room. Sunlight reached through the window and rested across the floor. The iron gradually stopped ticking. Nobody immediately added fuel. They waited. The room remained tolerable. A coat was still useful indoors. The child kept a blanket around the shoulders. The wall near the door stayed cool. But for the first time in months, the cabin held enough warmth without the stove consuming something every few minutes. That silence felt unfamiliar. Without the crackle of fuel and movement of iron, smaller sounds returned. Water dripping from the roof. A bird somewhere beyond the wall. Hooves shifting in softening ground. Wind moving across grass beginning to emerge from snow. The outdoor world was becoming readable again. Paths reappeared. Fence posts rose from shrinking drifts. The barn stood clearly instead of fading into white. A person could walk to the fuel pile without carrying the fear of losing the cabin behind them. Inside, winter stores were counted one final time. Some families had enough. Others borrowed, purchased, hunted, traded, or lived on plain meals until new food became available. The first green plants did not immediately fill a pot. A field emerging from snow was only a promise of work. Seed had to remain seed. Grain stored for planting could be eaten. It was food in the hand, and a crop only an imagination. A hungry household had to protect part of its supply from its present need. The future sat in sacks while supper remained thin. Livestock stepped into longer daylight. A cow might produce more milk as feed and conditions improved. Chickens responded gradually. Animals that had survived were thinner, dirtier, and more valuable than ever. Their survival meant the family still possessed movement, food, breeding stock, or something that could be sold. Barn doors opened wider. Bedding came out. Waste accumulated through winter became spring labour. Fences needed repair. Tools required inspection. Leather was cleaned. Handles were tightened. Seed was sorted. The work did not lessen. It changed direction. For months, effort had been defensive. Preserve heat, food, water, animals, and strength. Now the family prepared to produce again. The one room changed with them. Bedding was aired outside when weather allowed. Soot and winter grime were wiped from walls, shelves, and objects. Stored items moved. The door remained open for longer periods. Fresh air entered without feeling like an enemy. The stove still cooked meals, but it no longer commanded every hour. Its iron surface cooled between uses. The narrow ring of warmth around it dissolved, allowing people to occupy more of the room. The stove no longer required feeding through every hour. That was the change that mattered. For months, the room had measured time by the opening of an iron door. Now the pauses between fires grew longer. By evening, the temperature fell again. One small piece of fuel went inside, not an armful, only what the room required. A flame moved briefly behind the iron door, then settled. Nearby, a damp mitten hung from its peg. Water tapped slowly from the roof. The fuel stack had nearly disappeared, leaving flattened grass and loose chips where the winter reserve had once stood. The floor was still dirty, the walls were still patched. The room remained too small for the lives it contained. But the last light of the day reached farther across the boards than it had the week before. Then snow loosened from the roof and slid quietly to the ground. No one rushed to the window. They had already heard what it meant.